we've actually seen that the European Union is also increasingly taking on the approach of supporting infrastructure development projects, and many politicians like the huge infrastructure projects. They like seeing new airports, new brick and mortar, highways. But every time the EU is investing in that, it is doing that at the expense of other soft issues like human rights, like governance, and that are really critical for the development.
Hello, I'm Virginia Mucchi. I'm the head of outreach and impact at ECDPM, and I'm here with Amandine. We will talk about this exciting project that you are working on, right? What is this project about?
Hello, Virginia. We look indeed at the changes in the EU development policy, and we want to see how this affects the relationship with the partner countries. We are now looking at the implications at partner country level in different countries, looking at different topics as well, and speaking with different stakeholders. So the idea is to look at for instance, the interest-driven approach and how it relates, how it affects the way they are working, the way the partnerships are built, and also, last but not least, how the mutual interest between the EU and African partners are defined.
Okay, and how did the project start?
The project started a bit more than a year ago when an African partner country's government contacted us to accompany them in addressing those changes. We decided to build on this request to actually change the perspective and look at how the partner countries receive those changes. We're used to look at how this affects the relationship between the EU and the member states or the EU decision making itself, but here we wanted really to have another viewpoint and look at the impact of that
from partner countries. And what was your the two main findings of the first part of the work?
The first one is about communication. Communication was somehow mismanaged between the EU and African partner countries. In some way, they knew something was happening, but they didn't know to which extent this will affect their partnership with the EU. Sometimes it was for good reasons, because the EU itself was not able to understand to which extent the changes would be operationalized and would be reflected in their work with the partner countries. And this created some frustration in the relationship. The second finding is connected to communication, because the communication around Global Gateway, for instance, created high expectations about huge fundings for infrastructure, etc., which took actually a lot of time to translate in reality. Hello, my name is Amandine Sabourin and I work with ECDPM, the European Centre for Development Policy Management. There have been big shifts in the European approach to development cooperation recently. They affect the way the EU, the European Union, builds its relationship with the partner countries, but also the way the EU funds the programs and the activities of development cooperation. We're used to looking at this at the effects of the shifts from Brussels, but now we wanted to change the lenses a bit and see how these changes affect or are perceived in the partner countries. In November 2023, we published a paper on the political and practical implications of the EU development policy shifts. We looked at Kenya and Cameroon in particular, and now we want to broaden the scope of our research. We want to look at more countries, topics, and actors. I'm joined today by Moses Isooba. He's the executive director of the Uganda National NGO Platform. And we will talk about the relationship between the EU and the civil society and how these changes are perceived. Good afternoon, Moses.
Good afternoon. It's my singular pleasure to be here and to talk on a very important topic that is really pivotal in shaping development and humanitarianism in not only in Uganda but in the whole world. Thank you.
Maybe we could start, Moses, with you telling us a bit more about the National NGO Forum that you're running. When was it created? Who are your members?
So the Uganda National NGO Forum, it's a membership organization. We have about 750 members, and these are both national and international organizations in the country. But it's also a platform, and of course, as a platform and working in Uganda, where the operational space or the civic space is severely constrained, we are also supporting organizations to be able to broaden, to expand their operational space and their civic space. So we say we are the forest to which the organizations run to when the devil chases them.
In those efforts. Yeah. To build the structural dialogues with the donors, what would be the place of the EU to support civil society in your country, and how is it supporting its legitimacy, the capacity, and the role as a governance actor?
The EU and the European delegation in Uganda is definitely one of the perhaps most respected donors in the country. And these structured dialogues that we've been having, we've been having them with the support of the European Union. And because of the fact that the European Union brings together a number of different bilateral donors who are in the country, they're definitely quite pivotal. Perhaps one would say they are next to the US. And in terms of relations with the civil society, the European Union has continued to play quite a central role. I know in the case of Uganda, we've been having until recently the Democratic Governance Facility. The Democratic Governance Facility was the single most important source of civil society funding. And this was, largely supported by the European Union and a couple of other organizations. And I know that for quite some time, the European Union was chairing the steering committee. And as chairing the steering committee of such an important basket fund, like the Democratic Governance Facility, which I said is like the single largest CSO funding mechanism, I think was so good. And they've been able to support the sector to an extent that I think the sector was starting to thrive. The sector was starting to be able to do its work. And I think that made the government a bit uncomfortable. And I think 2 years ago, the government decided to close the Democratic Governance Facility. Of course, on patently false allegations that this facility was supporting opposition, which definitely is not true. And that then has left the sector, the civil society sector, in a fairly difficult position. But in terms of civil society support, the European Union continues to be a major player, continues to be a pace setter of some sort, despite the fact that when you ask a number of civil society organizations, we also know that while we get the support from civil society, from the European Union, is perhaps one of those funding partners that can be really very difficult to satisfy in order to be able to get your proposal out. Because you definitely need to be a fairly big organization with good staffing to be able to tick off all the boxes as required. So sometimes, that's really the challenge that we do have.
Thank you for sharing this challenge as well to work with the EU. Has there been any evolution recently regarding that, like those conditions to work with the EU for the civil society, for instance?
I think what we've seen, and I think this is oftentimes with people, because every time we talk about donors, or whether you're talking of also NGOs, we need to appreciate that behind the veil of a donor, and I think a donor is a veil but behind it are the really human beings with warm bodies and like you and me. And we've had some fairly good people in the delegation who understand the context within which we work. They understand the civil society context. And when we have those kind of people, then that cycle seems to be okay. But because these are diplomats on sort of a tour of duty, after about 4 years ago they leave, and then we've actually invested in building trust, building relationships. Then they return to Brussels, and then we get a new crop of men and women. Some of them, somebody comes to Uganda, you say, oh, where have you been? Oh, I've been in Guatemala. I've been in El Salvador. I've been in Slovakia. And these would be countries with different political landscapes. And so it takes time for the person to be able to understand the political landscape. And then it also takes time to build trust with the people. As the Dutch say, that trust comes on foot, but trust lives on a horseback. So essentially meaning it takes time to build trust. That's why they say trust comes on foot, but it quickly lives on a horseback. And so if you have invested in building this trust, and then the person leaves, the focal point person leaves, that is usually becomes injurious. So that is really one of the things. But also one of the changes that we've actually seen is on the Global Gateway project. And whether this is in response to the Chinese expansionism with their Belt Road initiative, we've actually seen that the European Union is also increasingly taking on the approach of supporting infrastructure development projects. And many politicians like the huge infrastructure projects. They like seeing new airports, new brick and mortar, highways. But every time the EU is investing in that, it is doing that at the expense of other soft issues like human rights, like governance, and that are really critical for the development. But we've definitely seen that what's happening now, if you look at the huge amount of resources getting into these large infrastructure projects, and less is getting into civil society organizations that are working on these software issues. And also we see that right now there is sort of like a tendency for whatever money is available, give it to one big organization. And that is also itself a challenge. It may be that the European Union is trying to cut down its transaction costs. Then it is able to manage few cooperative agreements. But I think it would pay off higher dividends if this money was actually sort of like split up into small amounts and then goes to these different organizations. It might be as small as 20,000 euros, 50,000 euros, but that's really a good amount of money to change the social indicators in certain communities. And the more you have that, the better. And so it is important that I think the European Union, and maybe actually the conversation needs to start here from Brussels, that it's not about bigger is better, but perhaps being able to split up and be able to support as many as possible, because civil society will definitely take we take pride in our diversity, in our multiplicity, in our dynamic nature, and the more you support, the better.
What you said about the Global Gateway is very interesting. And I was wondering, the Global Gateway strategy is a value-based strategy supposed to integrate the promotion of the values, human rights, democracy, gender equality, etc. And one of the questions now is actually to reflect on how the values can be put on the table now that the focus is on the investments, on the infrastructure. How can can human rights, democracy, and the support to those fields still remain high in the agenda?
I think the European Union needs to be very careful in terms of rolling out on the global gateway project. Because if you ask many people in the South, we think that the global gateway is a direct response to Chinese expansionism, and it's like the countering the Belt initiative of the Chinese. And so when we're looking at this, we're looking at this as a mirror reflection of the Chinese Beltway. And the Chinese are, pouring in colossal amount of resources in infrastructure development. And they're not asking these leaders, they're not asking the repressive and autocratic regimes about aspects of human rights, adherence to human rights. You work with civil society organizations, issues of civic space. The Chinese are not asking that. And I think it's important that as the European Union rolls out the Global Gateway project, that it resists going the way of the Chinese, where all these soft issues get quickly dropped on the table. I think it is still important that even if you are working on an infrastructure project, that is very important that these values are embedded. For instance, if you're going to support, let's give an example, you're going to support a road construction. You're wanting to make sure that the people whose land is being taken, that they are getting a fair compensation. You're going to make sure that there is, environmental impact assessments are done. You're going to want to make sure that, labor laws of the country are respected. You want to make sure that, you are financing a project in a country where there is adherence to these universal principles. And so I think it's going to be incumbent upon the European Union and its funding agencies, whether it's the African Development Bank or any, to make sure that these values do not fall through the cracks. Because if they do, then we would say, yes, European Union is the same as China.
With this shift towards more financialization, as it is called, we noticed as well two other shifts regarding the partnership. The partnership with the partner countries is supposed to be more inclusive. Does that relate to the NGOs? According to you, are the civil society organizations more consulted by the EU delegations or the EU family in general?
Well, I think to be brutally honest, some of these processes, I wouldn't say that civil society organizations are really being consulted. I mean, even on subjects like the Global Gateway strategy, if you ask a number of civil society organizations in Uganda, they would not have an idea about what this is all about. Whether you're asking about civil society organizations or what is this whole concept of Team Europe, many civil society organizations would not have anything to they know do, and this is because I think the delegation is not making sufficient efforts. I think it would have been very, very good if the delegation made a conscious and deliberate effort to try and work with civil society organizations to provide that information on this. But I think there seems to be a unilateral, sort of like a vertical from Brussels to the delegation, and then the delegation feeds back into the country. And I do not see the delegation taking a conscious and deliberate effort to provide make consultation spaces and be able to get input. So oftentimes a few instances we are getting in these conversations, perhaps these structured dialogues with the donors, or when there's been a call for proposals, and that is it. So really, in the true sense of the word inclusivity, I think we are not there. We're not there.
Thank you. Talking about the priorities again, bouncing back of what you were saying about the global gateway and the evolution towards more infrastructure, etc. Did you perceive an evolution, a shift in the priorities of the EU in Uganda and in the partnership between the EU and Uganda?
And I think we definitely, as civil society organizations, we see a shift, or we see a shift. And this is because in the case of Uganda, we do have elections every 5 years, but we've had one president since 1986. And I think as we've had this one president in 1986, there have been all calls of, democratic reversals, aspects of, human rights abuse. There have been also aspects of no rule of law, but rule by law. There have also been all instances where the different elections have been contested. And I think the European Union has oftentimes tried to make mention of this. But I think what that has meant, there's been a reset of some sort in terms of relationship with the government. Not that I, as civil society organization, would know what is being discussed in the diplomatic circles, but I think we know that with those governance deficits and also the recent passage of the Anti-Homosexuality Act, that these two definitely have a huge bearing on how the European Union is rolling out the red carpet for the government.
Considering this shift in the EU Uganda priorities, and considering as well that the programs of the European Union are supposed to be decentralized and geographized, which means that they are shaped and delivered more at country level, so more tailor-made at country level. How could the support to the CSOs be more integrated to other sectors beyond the contribution of the CSOs to the civic, to broadening the civic space and to the democratic governance role of the CSOs?
I think to be true to the geographization, or to be true to making sure that development interventions or the conceptualization of all these interventions at the country level, I think one of the things that the EU needs to be alive to, which is now across many development partners, is the conversation of locally led development, the conversation of driving the localization agenda. I think the EU would have to make sure that it's, this is something that they can breathe life into at the national level. And what that means, that then the EU needs to be deliberate at leveraging local leadership, leveraging local knowledge and local expertise, and also leveraging local design and implementation of the projects. Whether it is on infrastructure projects, we have universities that are producing engineers, and therefore it would mean that how on any project you want to make sure that you are using that expertise. If it's an area where the EU is supporting in, say, vaccine production, you want to ensure that, yes, once these biosafety labs are set up, that you can actually then be able to use the local expertise of people. And I think for us, that really is important, because when that happens at the EU country level, then as civil society organizations, we can then be able to dive deeper and also then reflect that with our communities. And then at a community level, increasingly we also have to appreciate that when it comes to development, it's not all about only money, because yes, we need large money from the European Union, but I think it's also important to see how we can leverage the small monies that's available, how we can leverage the local knowledge, the local competences, the local leadership. And once we leverage that, then what's going to happen is that then we're able to trigger community voice and community power, we're able to have a new way of looking at development. We're going to have a new way of appreciating and a new way of creating a sense of ownership. That these projects are not going to have an EU logo, an EU banner, but people just get a sense that this is something that is ours. And that is, that's really, really important. And as civil society organizations, then we start looking at communities, and not just as beneficiaries, but as co-investors as well. But I think also in terms of the European Union, it's important that even as it rolls out the development agenda, whether it's on infrastructure projects, whether it's on softer skills, that I think there's need also to change the language of development and humanitarianism. I think we need to be really changing the language that creates binaries of the developed and undeveloped, of the rich and poor countries. And because that creates a sort of like, once you have those binaries, it creates of who has and who doesn't have. And I think we need to be moving away from that. And the more we try to move away from that, the more we put the mantle of development into the hands of the countries. And then by extension, we as civil society organizations can put the mantle of development in the communities.
Thank you very much, Moses. Thanks a lot for this. And I think you summarized pretty well the need to articulate the global and geopolitical challenges with the support to locally led initiatives and that bring more ownership.
Thank you. Let me end maybe just also with one small thing. Of course, as we get support from the European Union, we also know that the European Union has its own challenges right at the door. With the war in Ukraine is taking a toll on the European Union. We hear now that resources are being cut. This morning I was talking to people and the delegation in Uganda, and we hear that cuts have been done, and these are taking immediate effects. I definitely think there is quite a higher appetite for supporting a problem which is at the door. But I think while this is being done, it's going to be important that the investment that has been done by the European Union is not thrown out of the window. I think yes, it's important that the European Union addresses itself to the problems in Ukraine, but also it's important that the European Union continues to support Africa and in different ways. And then the other thing that, of course, I also like to call on the European Union, I think it's also important the European Union understands civil society configurations in a way that we have the organizations and then we have the platforms. And I think the platforms play a fairly different, unique role. And every time resources are put and they're just put in the general pool, it makes platforms like ours to really be, sort of like left out of the, getting into these resources. So I think it will be very good that the civil society support is, we have two streams. There's going to be a stream for supporting the network organizations who play an umbrella role, who play a role of being like incubators, who play a role of being like providing the greenhouse effect to the small organizations and their incubators. They need a different type of support. And so you just don't want to pour that and just create a higher cut competition.
But this is also the usual dynamic and maybe dilemma of the civil society organizations. But this is also the usual dynamic and maybe dilemma of the civil society organizations, and especially with the umbrella organizations, which play, and more generally for CSOs, who play a role of advocacy on the one hand, and also contribute to the delivery of services or contribute to being expert on their sectors. So there is this double role that play the CSOs. And that's the whole question of the support of the EU. How can it be active on both sides?
Exactly.
Politically, there is a need to support the role of civil society of being part of the civic space, and more financially, to support financially the growth of CSOs.
Yep.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Good day. Thank you.